So I've just written a novel which is all about a fictional character, but based on a true story of someone who was one of my patients living in Bermondsey. Obviously, it's fully anonymized. But just to tell you a little bit about myself, so I, as I said, I'm a community old age psychiatrist, and in 1998, I came straight from an MD as a higher trainee in old age psychiatry, and I was thrust into a sort of thriving culture of the docks in Bermondsey, and that brought with it a sort of drinking culture. We had a docky population, we had an older Irish population, and that made for a lot of, I suppose, alcohol-related morbidity, and that really was part of the Bermondsey culture, and it meant that most of my well, not most of my a lot of my patients had drinking problems. But the problem I had was I had several challenges. So the first challenge was that I had colleagues, psychiatrists, taking interest in people with alcohol problems, but they certainly weren't ready to sort of embrace the idea that they were having a colleague who had an interest in something that wasn't something familiar to them. So that was one of the biggest problems I had. I also obviously had the problem of ageism, in that if we had someone with an alcohol problem, it sometimes meant that they were passed from pillar to post because of their age. So they didn't have a service to meet their needs very often. The third problem I had was that there were in effect no carrots. We had obviously a group of older drinkers for whom it wasn't easy to find solutions. So they didn't have they didn't have their job. They very often didn't have a relationship because they'd often lost their spouse or they were living alone. That was another problem. A third problem was the lack of training. So the lack of training that was offered to people to pick up alcohol problems. So it could have been in primary care, it could have been anywhere really, in the medical wards in A&E and so on. And that led, so all those things meant that there was a sort of therapeutic nihilism about the detection and treatment of alcohol problems. So that was in 1998. And by about 2000, I was beginning to find that this was becoming so much of a problem that I had to do something about it. So in 2000, I can just give you an example. So in 2003, I ran an old age psychiatry ward, and at that time, 50% of my patients, can you believe 50% of an old age psychiatry ward had an alcohol problem? So there could have been harmful use of alcohol, it could have been alcohol dependence, but they certainly were a population for whom I had very little to offer. So literally what happened was in 2003, I was sitting there on my ward thinking to myself, well, either I let this go for the rest of my career, or I try and do something about it. And what the something about it meant was that I did an MSc in addictions. So it was an MSc in the clinical and public health aspects of addictions. I knew nothing about it. I failed my clinical exam in the what we call the MRC psych exam to become a psychiatrist, because I failed to detect an alcohol problem. So it just shows you how little I knew about alcohol problems. But did the MSc, and I suppose the rest is history. So what I've done over the last sort of 15 years or so, in addition to what I'm going to talk about in a minute, 20 years later, I've written a book, and I wanted to read you an excerpt from that book because it means a great deal to me. It's something very close to my heart. It took me 6 months to write, and it's called Catch Me When I Fall. So this is an excerpt. This is just like a 2-minute excerpt from the book, which gives you an idea about the sort of problems that I had to deal with and the sort of patients that I came across. And this is Peggy Leiterman sitting in front of her grandmother clock when she's sitting in the living room, and this is what she experiences. What started as a faint ticking from the grandmother clock in the passage grew progressively louder and more imposing. Each tock signaled another lost moment, seeping away from her existence, draining her of every last sinew of emotion. a shipwrecked sailor clinging on to life in a cold, lonely, unforgiving ocean of grief. Just when she thought she had got into the swing of things, pangs of sadness would wash over her, leaving her so helpless that she would burst into tears. It had happened while shopping down the Blue. It had even happened in the cinema last week when she had gone with Pat and Babs to see a special screening of It's a Wonderful Life. How pathetic was that irony as she sat there staring at those four walls. All she had left now was her memories. Her eyes flitted between pictures of her sisters with their husbands, her nephews, nieces, and their children, none of her own children. They had tried, but it was not to be. Her gaze moved to a picture of her parents and other black and white pictures of her childhood, opening her mind like Pandora's box. Hope was now all she had. That just gives you an example of the kind of desolation that was faced by my patients, and the difficulty I had in trying to offer them a kind of more secure future, particularly with trying to improve their drinking. So I suppose what the basis of the what I'm going to be discussing today for a little while longer is how I try to deal with someone who had both alcohol problems and mental health problems, and what were the sort of interventions that I could offer them. Now, one of the things about older people with alcohol problems is that they have very different problems to the kind of things that you might find with younger people. So, for example, things like domestic violence, things like drink driving, things like other problems such as employment, for example. It's not so much a problem when you're over the age of 65. The kind of problems we do have is we still have, say mood problems, we still have anxiety and depression, but above all, we also have dementia. And dementia is a big problem. And the prevention of dementia is something that we need to, I think, focus on a little bit more in our day-to-day lives. And what I've done over the last 15 years, I've worked with a number of different organizations. I've worked with the International Longevity Center. I've worked with Age UK. I've worked with Age Concern, which is now Age UK. I've worked with Alcohol Concern, which is now Alcohol Change. And I've worked with Drinkwise Age Well, which was a culmination of not just me, but the sort of work and plugging away at the media and policy that I tried to do for a number of years, particularly from 2003 up till about 2015, which is about the time that Drinkwise Age Well was launched. I think it was 2014 that the £25 million funding from the National Lottery came to fruition. So what I really wanted to say was that we're looking at the population, I know I keep going on about in the media, but this is a population of baby boomers. So this is people born between 1964 and 1947, 1964. And I'm actually the tail end of the baby boomers. So I grew up with, if you like, the population that I'm sure some of you share my age and the population. And this is a population there's a highest risk of alcohol-related problems. So whether that be alcohol-related admissions, whether that be alcohol-related deaths, whether that be drinking over recommended limits, which is now obviously low-risk limits, or whether that be a population that has reduced their alcohol intake the least compared with other age groups. We're looking at a population at risk, and it's something that we need to do something for, population we need to do something for, both in terms of prevention and in terms of addressing the detection, the intervention, the treatment, and the aftercare of older people with alcohol misuse, and in addition to that, people with coexisting mental disorders. So what I've tried to do, particularly in the last 10 years, is raise the profile of the problems that older people with alcohol problems and accompanying mental disorders have, particularly in the media, particularly with regard to the statistics that come out year on year. And unfortunately, the sort of statistics that come out are few and far between now. There are so few of them, and people are still concentrating on younger people's drinking. And I think that's a little bit ridiculous that we know that older people are more at risk, and yet we still concentrate on younger people's drinking. But that's besides the point. I've tried to include it in policy. So I've had meetings with the Department of Health. I've tried to bang the drum in terms of my own research, but also in terms of the growing need to do something about this rising problem. And so in 2019, if you look at the NICE website, I've done a sort of best practice model for how we should be addressing older people's drinking. Older people's drinking is now included in the NICE quality standard. I can't remember the number of the quality standard, but so all older people should be asked about their drinking when they present to services, doesn't matter what services they present to. I've also managed to lastly include the dual diagnosis, so the addressing the needs of older people with alcohol misuse and coexisting mental disorders in the new national framework, community framework for all age groups, including older adults. So I think there's been a lot of progress there, I like to think, and it's been a passion of mine. So when I've had the opportunity to take on other senior leadership roles over the last 20 years, I've always come back to Bermondsey. I've always come back to what I love dearly, and that inspired me to write the book and also develop research. So I've just submitted a paper on, so for example, COVID, alcohol use before and after lockdown. Got another paper in the pipeline. Try to develop clinical services. So we're the only clinical service, I think, in the UK that has routine documentation of the alcohol use disorders identification test to monitor, to detect and monitor alcohol use and to offer interventions. And so all of our 17 older adult services have rates of screening at the moment of 50% or more or higher for the audit. The last thing we've done is we offer training for dual diagnosis level training 2 for all people in dealing with older people, assessing and treating older people with alcohol problems. So I suppose I wanted to conclude with a statement to say that I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I really don't think that anyone can call themselves an expert if they're purely an academic, if they're purely a clinician. So what I've spent 20 years, 15 years or more trying to do is to triangulate the picture, to try and do some research, to try and run a service that has high standards in terms of the detection of alcohol and problems and mental disorders, to raise the profile in the media, but also to have an influence, from policy, within policy. So that's the end of my kind of spiel, really, and that's the end of it. This is the culmination of a very long journey that has lasted for 2 decades or more, to try and bring to the forefront the burgeoning need to address a growing population with a problem that's not going to go away for at least 15, 20 years, and something that we need to do something about. And what we need, I think, to try and do is to harness the collective voice, which I know the name is the name of an organization, but the collective voice of public health, clinical services, policy, academics, teachers, and really a wider group of people working in the voluntary and community sector, voluntary organizations, to try and see how we can improve the lives, particularly the health and well-being of older people with alcohol use disorders. So that's all I've got to say.
That's excellent, Tony. Thank you. It's a great start and a very moving piece you read out there from your book. I think it gives those of us who haven't direct experience some insight into just how miserable this set of circumstances can be. I just wonder whether I might use my opportunity just to ask you a bit about, you mentioned you've written a couple of papers, or maybe you're still in the sort of editorial process about these changes pre and post COVID. I mean, could you give us a sketch without, never necessarily nailing your colours to the mast, but just of what you've seen happening in those numbers and maybe also in your clinical experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't tell you what the research findings are, but I can give you a clue, because all my research, I mean, I wouldn't say it's like sort of a huge cohort epidemiological studies, but what I've done in my career is I've used my clinical findings or kind of hunches to inform research. So, for example, I was absolutely sure from my clinical work that cognitive impairment improved when you stop drinking, and I did a paper to prove that, and that's an advanced diagnosis. When lockdown came on, I was absolutely sure that we were beginning to see a higher number of people, proportion of people, with alcohol problems, and so I did research on it. I won't tell you what the findings were, but they weren't perhaps unsurprising to my clinical observations.
Okay, well, you're teasing us with that one a little, but I mean, from the figures we see, there's a kind of a polarization in the pattern of drinking. That people who were drinking more seem to sort of double down, or statistically speaking, double down on their drinking maybe, and then those on the the lesser sort of drinking side of sometimes moderated and reduced the amount they're drinking. I mean, broadly speaking, is that a reasonable sort of sketch of what?
Yes, I think I won't tell you about my own research, but it's certainly something that's been replicated from other studies across the board. They're not high quality studies. They talk about drinking more and drinking less, and the public health England figures talk about high risk drinking. But yeah, there's generally a feeling that the people who were drinking quite a lot, increasing risk or dependent drinking, the stress from COVID has pushed them more into high risk drinking. The people who are drinking nothing or hardly anything at all were more likely to make changes. So I think that's a general pattern that's replicated.
Yeah, and just to again talk sort of in general terms, but I mean, have you seen among your patients or colleagues' patients a kind of response to the COVID crisis? I mean, obviously, I think my own response, and all our responses kind of varied over time, but in general terms, have people found a time which is sort of in some ways stimulated them to drink, or found that they've reason to change their behaviours for the better?
So yes, I mean, so coming back to that, I think for people who weren't drinking very much at all, I think COVID has when they're under lockdown, they're more aware about monitoring their own drinking behaviour, and that's probably why they've stopped. And similarly with people who were drinking quite a lot, it's made them less easy to cope. And I'm obviously Sean's going to talk about that, but in terms of smart recovery and so on. But I think what we're seeing is that polarisation has become more polar than it was before.
Okay, and one final question before we move on to the next speaker. But do you find that your specialism is older people? So I suppose in statistical terms you have a kind of biased sample. But are there particular challenges that people of more age who are experiencing in the current situation, as versus to the rest of the population?
So old. I mean, I suppose in a funny sort of way, it's the younger baby boomers who are suffering more than the older baby. The older baby boomers are probably more used to being socially isolated, and I think what we're seeing is that it's the younger population, baby boomers, who are bearing the brunt of this, because you're talking about the 55, 65 people who are still working. So for whom lockdown has probably affected them more. They're not used to being at home. And so things like, for example, caring for relatives or being with a partner that they weren't used to being with, I think that those sort of unfamiliar pressures are putting more pressure on them and affecting their drinking.